All right, everybody, thanks for logging on and taking the time to watch this video on how to navigate line lunches in the fire environment. So let's go ahead and first talk about what comes in a typical line lunch. So for those of you who are familiar, you've probably seen a CAL FIRE line lunch that consists of somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 calories of food. And depending on your shift, maybe you're expending up to 2 to 3,000. It's a kind of debatable because the shifts vary just so wildly depending on the nature of what's going down with your job task for that day. So if you're doing a 12-hour line cut where you're just prepping all day or you're hotlining, those are going to be drastically different circumstances and demands placed upon your nutrient intake than, let's say, you're staging, or maybe you're just DCing hose all day, or maybe you're just walking and monitoring, or you're holding at night, things like that. So this video comes with kind of a caveat of don't take this to heart as like a end all be all solution for how to navigate your lunch on an everyday basis, because you're going to have to explore your unique demands, your weight, your preferences, and I'm not here to be the food police and tell you what to eat, what not to eat. It's just for those of you looking to have some basic principles to abide by when you look at that giant gauntlet of things they throw in your lunch and you're wondering, do I need all this? What's my bang for my buck? What's the best things to keep? What are some things I can throw out? And that's what I hope this video can offer you. So let's go ahead and get into some of the characteristics of a line lunch. So they're calorically dense. Of course, we need energy for the jobs that we do. There's been days where I eat close to everything in my lunch because we're probably burning most of it. And throughout the course of a day, I could easily assume that I'm between my basal metabolic rate, my activities, and just like the thermic effect of food in general, all of those three components that make up our total daily energy expenditure probably put me anywhere above like 35 to 4,500 calories, like at least, maybe even up to five on select days. But those seem to be kind of few and far in between. So it's rare that I'm ever going to eat most of my lunch, whether it's going to be a fed or a Cal Fire lunch. I'd prefer to eat chow, kind of just filling up on that morning and nightly meals. Just that's my personal preference. I'd rather eat, I don't know. I can't really say those eggs are real, but I hope that some of the most of that food is a little bit more holistic and natural than what comes in these lunches, which is by nature going to be a lot of processed food. So these lunches are really calorically dense. They don't necessarily have the biggest return based on that energy consumption value. And we'll get into what I mean by that in a little bit. But they're also very high in sodium. So for those of you with hypertension or maybe certain cardiovascular risk factors, this is something to kind of hone in on, especially if you're not sweating a ton that day. If you are taking a fire salt, an element, something like that, and you're already getting a ton of sodium, maybe it's worth the extra added layer in your mind to kind of decrease the insane amounts of sodium in some of these things. Like if you eat an entire pack of beef jerky, it's a monumental amount of sodium that's in that thing for such a little amount of return calorically. So that's something that I kind of keep in mind when I'm looking at the foods. I look at the sodium levels and try to give myself a realistic outlook of what's my day going to look like from a total sodium intake standpoint if I eat this entire lunch. It's well going to be above my demands most likely, unless I'm in a sauna for 24 hours. They're pretty low in fiber in most of these foods. I'm not going to say all because it is possible to get a decent fiber intake. I feel like from my experience with at least the giant mass of food here, if I narrow it down, I can find at least a few different um, sources of good fiber in these packs typically. So they're there. You have to scout out and look for them. But most of the time, when I observed people throwing away things, it was usually the fiber filled ones, which I thought was kind of ironic because these are going to be the most filling. We'll get in, there's a whole cascade of fiber benefits, and we'll get into that in this next slide. I'm really excited for it to show you some of those studies. But Yeah, they're typically, for the most part, these are going to be low in fiber from the majority of the things that this pack consists of. They're pretty high in added and refined grains, so that's the stuff that tastes good. That's the things that everybody wanted to keep. And unfortunately, those things are probably not going to be the best in terms of long-term health outcomes. Like if you were to continue at that pace throughout your entire lifespan, I'd say you're doing yourself a disservice. But again, I am not the food police. If that helps you mentally get through the day, having some sort of cookie like you see here, these are bomb, but it's 400 calories and it's probably like 80 grams, not, I don't know, somewhere around that of added sugars or like refined sugars, just probably not whole grains. So yeah, I would veer on the side of caution of making this your norm at least. But if you can suffer through it and get through the day without that cookie, then I would say shy away. Low in single ingredient foods. When I look at foods that are natural, I would say the apples, oranges ones are obvious examples of this. It's things that just kind of occur as you grow them and they don't have to have any factory processing or additional things added to them. Like this Nugo bar, which I do have those, but I have to acknowledge that that's not a single ingredient food and there's a fair amount of processing that goes into those. Same thing with Cliff Bars, same things with these Uncrustables, same things with the sandwiches. Like those at its core are not single ingredient foods. There's obviously a spectrum between minimally processed and heavily processed and single ingredient. So it's not up to me to decide what is the best food out there for you. And I'm not a dietitian. I'm not here to prescribe anything. I'm just here to present you with some principles that I think align with the scientific literature and can set you up to be in a good mindset to navigate these line lunches, which are not straightforward. And it's going to be a highly complex equation you deal with yourself every day if you're like me, trying to play a risk reward push pull balance between giving myself the energy I need for the job and trying to keep a health conscious mindset. They're lacking in key micronutrients. You're definitely, I would assume, missing out on a lot of essential vitamins and minerals without the access to, I don't know, foods in a store that you could go and buy and have a little bit of a better mindset behind this when you're getting just a ton of processed and packaged foods in those lunches. I am willing to bet that they're all going to be lacking in most vitamins and minerals. So whether it's worth it to you to make the added investment and get some different supplements or extra little purchases at stores to put in your compartments and containers, then great. If not, I'm sure between the chow at night in the morning and this, you'll be able to find your way if you look through all the packaging at some basic vitamins and key minerals of importance for you. So that's kind of a gray area for me. Haven't exactly figured out the perfect way to navigate this. It's kind of questionable whether the efficacy of a vitamin or multivitamin supplement is like long term going to do the same thing as having the benefits of consuming the foods that are high in all of those different substances. So I'll kind of leave this to the dietitians. I would like to phone a friend on that one and see what their experience are with dealing with tactical populations and assessing nutrient deficiencies with respect to these vitamins and minerals. So without further ado, let's go and assess what the line lunch looks up, what my line lunch ends up being. Now, let's go ahead and look at what my line lunch ends up being after I make my qualitative assessment on what I need for that day and what foods I want to prioritize. I have three kind of principles that I rely on to keep me in track with these line lunches. I want to have a line lunch that supports my caloric expenditure for that day. So, like I talked about, if I am going and doing some potential hotlining or prepping, like if I'm in the initial stages of that fire, I know I'm probably going to have a little bit of a higher work demand because that fire is probably still ripping. But towards the ends of fires, when things get a little bit more mundane, relaxed, a lot of the like really hard days are done. I keep a pretty strict mindset about what's possible, and I keep some like extra things in my pack just a little bit harder to get to. Even just that physical barrier of keeping in a spot that's like a mission to get to. If I'm not working insanely hard, at least it's not there in my face. If I open up my lunch, it's not right there present with me, and I probably won't grab it and just mindlessly eat it because I feel like that's probably the source of most of the consumption of foods when you're not needing it on the line is just boredom. You have nothing to do, so you're just there to sit with it and think. If I'm working for 12 hours, I'm not even thinking about eating during 10 of those hours of the work. I don't feel hungry. I have this rush of catecholamines keeping me kind of dialed in and not really focused on the like overall consumption of foods being necessary. I could probably work until I passed out at that point during those types of days without even thinking about food. But of course, that's not the proper strategy as well. And I'll make a completely different lecture for fueling and supplements that you can keep on the line for kind of just short-term snacks to give you that energy when you don't have an hour-long lunch period. That helped me throughout the season, but that's for another video. So yeah, you want to make sure you do that kind of rough estimation of your caloric expenditure that day, and then make sure you give yourself the proper amount of fuel in a decently wide margin, I would say. You don't want to be out there and starving and have to work a 24-hour shift, so you have to kind of assess your own situation and what could potentially go down. Other than that, I try to, again, work that spectrum from single ingredient to maximally processed food and try to veer on that other side of the equation. I definitely want to get those single ingredient foods whenever I can, whether it's like fruits or vegetables, things like that. Those will always be in my lunch. And then I'll keep um, some basic foods that maybe when I look at the label don't have 1,500 ingredients or a million different oils involved in it. So if I can look at the package, like RX bars are a prime example of what is like something that's going to be in my lunch. Even though I've eaten 2,000 blueberry flavored RX bars, I'm so over them, but they only have 4 ingredients. They seem very wholesome and just minimally processed, and they abide by pretty much every principle that I have for a food that I want in my line lunch. So hats off to them for sticking to that principle and giving the fire service something that can be consumed on the fire line in a guilt-free manner, somewhat. To also really high in fiber, pretty good protein value there. So overall, big advocate for RX Bar, but I am in no way affiliated with them and am not paid by them or sponsored. The third principle is going to be a high protein intake. So whenever I can get protein bars in, protein supplements, anything like that, in that midday section where I'm probably going to be expending a ton of calories and I'm in a huge deficit, this is a period I like to make sure I'm really high in my protein, but the chow meals in morning and night are pretty easy to get some decent protein consumption. There's always a meat option for the veggie eaters out there. I'd say you might have to do a little bit of back end work with your own purchases, putting things in your compartment that you know are high quality protein filled sources. Because other than the meat, I don't imagine there's a ton of protein in the remainder of the options at those chow lines. So for the vegetarians and vegans out there, I would say I'll probably have to make another video with alternative sources and cost-effective strategies to bring in some foods and put them in your compartments to offset this kind of negative deficit from chow not being the best sources for you and the line lunches having kind of just vaguely obscure protein sources. I can't say they're all high quality because most of them, I imagine, are not third party tested. Most of them don't even tell you what amino acids are in there. So, with the concept of what I'm going for, of trying to stave off muscle loss, I really need to kind of have an idea of the branched chain amino acid content. And most of these protein bars do not have that. It just gives you a blanket 20 grams, 10 grams, 15 grams per serving kind of value. So this is another realm I need to navigate, and I will again ask for any dietitians or people in the nutrition field that have this answer to reach out to me so I can better inform those around me. But anyways, let's go ahead and get on to some of the fun stuff here, the research and the evidence that backs why I have these 3 principles and why they're so important. So when I look at these line lunches, the three principles I have fall in line with getting just key nutrients in when I can. So fiber is the big one. I want to bring up this insanely cool study to me. Unfortunately, it was all in males, so I would assume there's some crossover if there were to be some females in this. I would hope that the positive benefits would cross over, but I cannot confirm that since this was an all-male study in the Netherlands. But they looked at over 1,300 males across 40 years of a lifespan, kept in contact with them and updated on their health status. And they saw that in this whole range of persons, they saw that for every 10 grams of fiber that this theoretical person increased on average per day, they saw a 9% lower risk of death. So for every 10 grams of fiber that you included additionally, there was a continued return on your investment into your health. So the lower the fiber intake was per day, the more likely it was for you to die. That's a pretty convincing argument for why I want to get fiber in my diet from a general standpoint. The mechanism behind this could be multifaceted. It could be anti-inflammatory. It could be just the byproduct of you eating a ton of other healthy types of foods, or maybe it's associated with just various lifestyle factors that lead you to consume fiber. But nonetheless, I think it's worth mentioning that if you consumed 10 grams of fiber a day, you decreased your risk of death by 9%. That is a massive statistic, and I think it's pretty powerful. So let's move on to the next principle of consuming whole grains. If there's ever any whole grains in my line lunch, I'm for sure going to try to keep those, or maybe even try to go at store stops to get ingredients or products that have whole grains in them. They provide you with fiber. The study above gives you the reason why. Vitamins and minerals, and the best sources of sugars from the viewpoint of longevity. So, what allows me to make that argument? There's a study from Anderson in 2003 that saw a massive protective role with increased whole grain intake. So they do this typically in quantiles. So they take populations and they measure out your whole grain intake based on servings per week or grams per day, things like that. And they saw between highest and lowest quantiles of individuals, the highest level of intakers were 29% less likely to suffer cardiac events from cardiovascular disease, which I will get into another lecture. You're going to keep hearing me say this because I have so many ideas, but this is one of the heavy concerns for first responder populations, firefighters in particular. Cardiovascular disease plagued this population for decades, and it's still continuing. So I would imagine that if you can, whole grains in your diet, based on this study, would likely benefit you with that regard. Another study I'd like to bring up was done by Meyer in 2000, where they looked at 1,100 women in Iowa in a 6-year follow-up study. So they were all older above 65 years old. But this likely, I want obviously not everybody in the fire service is over 65 years old, but these individuals were said to operate on the same kind of behavioral lifestyle dietary influences forever. They were typical whole grain intake individuals at their quantile. So if they ate high levels of whole grains every week, the highest level being 17.5 servings. The next study I'd like to bring up involves aside from cardiovascular disease, I want to bring up a study done by Meyer in 2000 where they looked at over 1,100 women in Iowa. I will admit these individuals were all over 65, so that is limited in looking at the acute short-term health outcome stance of the fire population, who's typically not under 65, but it's worth mentioning for the inclusion of the mechanism and potential benefit as far as glucose regulation goes. So among this study, they divvied up each quartile of individuals based on their whole grain consumption. So there was low consumers, two groups in between, and then high consumers. And the highest group had over 17.5 servings per week of whole grains, and the lowest group had under 3. So this is a pretty stark contrast in consumption throughout those weeks, throughout the entire 6 years of this follow-up. But um, this yielded a really strong inverse association with whole grain consumption at every quartile. So the more you had, the less prevalence you saw of diabetes. So this involves the mechanism of glucose regulation, which has been hypothesized in several studies and for decades kind of been looked at. But this kind of points to that mechanism being relatively truthful, as they saw um, very strong levels of associations between a reduction in diabetes and the added levels of whole grains that you consumed on that given 6 year follow-up period. The last source of nutrient that I hone in on for my line lunch is protein. So whether you like it or not, you're probably going to be in a caloric deficit if you're doing massive amounts of work, especially if you're a hotshot. I know that in the beginning of the season, I found myself feeling super depleted, could not get enough calories from whole sources of foods, minimally processed. I had to really break some of my rules during several roles where we were just getting a massive amount of work done, and it definitely pushed me. I hated some of the foods I was eating, but I had to get those calories in just for even just the hunger aspect of it. I can't exactly say the amount of calories I was expending. I couldn't do a perfect cost kind of like benefit analysis of what would be worth it. But yeah, I found myself eating some foods that were not my preferred source. But as far as protein goes, it's one of the best tools that you can utilize to offset fat-free mass loss during caloric deficits. So for a population that is most likely going to spike out, going to have several days where they don't have the optimal amount of food to replenish those substrates they just burned from that course of the day or week, this is something to prioritize. And it's been explored in dozens of studies, but one that I'd like to bring up that gave some. Now, if you want to ask yourself how much protein does it take to attenuate that lean body mass loss during a calorie deficit, it's pretty questionable. I've seen studies and it kind of depends on the population you're looking at. I haven't necessarily seen any on protein supplementation with whey or BCAAs in a wildland firefighting context, but there's studies on backpacking and other types of activities, like, I don't know, even possibly a space flight and other things, but it's not applicable to our environment in the broadest sense, but the mechanism is still there. If you're in a positive nitrogen balance, if you have an added level of protein intake, you're likely staving off the um, detriment of your body using protein as a metabolic resource and overall having to break down certain tissues for an energy supply. So that I imagine is the basic principle to abide by when looking at all of these studies. Now, the amount is kind of up in question, like I said. Some may argue that 1.0 grams per kilogram per day is sufficient. Some people may say that 2.0 grams per kilogram per day is necessary. But I would argue that based on the amount of literature that I've seen and the recommendations from bodies like the ISSN, 1.2 to 1.8 grams per kilogram I think is a feasible number to hit with the wildland population in mind, just because getting 2 or 3 grams per kilogram in is a ton of protein, and it's not really possible. Maybe if you were getting fed a pound or two of meat every single day for dinner and having a ton of eggs in the morning and then having protein supplements throughout the day, like you could possibly hit it. But odds are you're not going to have access to all of those resources. So I think that 1.2 to 1.8 is kind of a feasible range with um, great return based on the scientific evidence and existing body of knowledge that we have on it. So to give you kind of an example of what this looks like, if you're 100 kilograms, 220 something pounds, and you wanted to try to get 1.8 grams per kilogram per day, you would multiply your 100 kilograms by 1.8 grams, and that would be the 180 grams of protein per day, which is a ton. But if you're on the lower end of that spectrum, you're still likely getting the benefits of staving off that muscle mass loss, and that would only be 120, which is a much more feasible number, at least if you are a carnivore, you were a meat eater. If you are a vegetarian or a vegan, again, it's going to have some added back end work on your part to make sure you bring things in your compartments that are high quality sources of protein. Because from what I've seen, the food that you're supplied with the fire camps are probably not the highest protein intakes, based on just vegetables and other sources beyond meats. My overall takeaway message is that you should not go into this line lunch process with the mindset of you're doomed, you're going to fail, it's a terrible lunch, there's no nutrient quality. I might as well just give up on my effort to be healthy today and just take this entire lunch, eat it all until I'm sad and energy depleted and my gut feels weird. Like I've heard the complaints endlessly and people just continue to do it. I want you to empower yourself with the mindset that you can make this lunch a relatively healthy option for your environment. You can do what you can with what you have, and it's not an all or nothing situation. You don't need to be healthy or not healthy. It can be just a spectrum that you operate on with given principles to set you up to be in the best position to supply your body with the energy it needs and the nutrients it needs to be healthy at the same time. So, I want you to take this and hopefully implement it to some degree in your off season to build up that habit, abide by those principles, do it successfully, and build this kind of automaticity with it. Go along with your building healthy habits lecture if you want, which is another resource that I have on this channel. But yeah, I'm very confident that this entire population can improve in this regard. They can all make do with what the line lunches offer. There's good things in there. This is not to be a pessimistic person in the field. I'm here to build you up and build your confidence to navigate this environment and have hope for yourself and to treat your season like it's not just a complete waste that you have to counteract when the off season comes around and build back up your health. You have the option to be healthy and have these traits still carry over into your season. It's not impossible, but it is hard. But if you already do a hard job, you do hard things, and this is just one more hard thing that you're going to accomplish if you want to put your mind to it.